Hi, this is Tech Support by RD, and in this video I'm going to be answering a viewer question, and I'm going to be responding to some other comments. All of these are from my How to Change DNS Settings video. Now I'm going to be using a TP-Link router, or at least a simulation of its interface, to answer this question, but the concepts that you'll learn from this video could be applied to those of you with routers from other brands. The comment goes like this. They're asking, there is a DHCP server that also has primary and secondary DNS. Is it the same thing if I put Cloudflare DNS just like in your video or not? Now, what they're referring to here is in the video, I entered the IP address of the Cloudflare DNS server 1.1.1.1 and 1.0.0.1 on the Internet tab, which is this one here. And let's say dynamic IP here for, for example, use the following DNS addresses 1.1.1.1, and I'm not going to go into too in-depth into how to change your IP. You can watch this video if you want to learn how these settings work, but basically that's what I instructed viewers to do in this particular video. But this comment is asking, DHCP server, this page here, also has primary and secondary DNS. Would it be the same thing if I enter 1.1.1.1 here and 1.0.0.1 here? Short answer, it's not. It's not the same thing, but here's a little bit of a longer answer. It turns out that most routers, especially residential routers like the one we're dealing with here, run their own DNS server. In fact, I can prove it. I'm going to show you a screenshot of my network connection details window. Of course, I have to blur out some details, but you could see that I have an IP address of 192.68.0.128 and a subnet mask and a default gateway, DHCP server, and a DNS server. You'll notice that you'll be perplexed, like this other commenter here. Let's go to their comment in a moment. That in spite of me typing, 1.1.1.1 or Cloudflare DNS in this video that I've shown, the DNS server shown on my device is still 192.168.0.1. What's up with that? Which is, response of this comment right here. I changed my DNS, but it still uses its own DNS for some reason. So in this context, they're saying, I did what you told me in the video. I chose, I specified my my own DNS server, yet it's still using its own DNS server. It turns out that the reason why our router is running a DNS server is, here's my hunch. Now, first of all, this particular router has a URL that you could visit, tplinkwifi.net, which allows you to easily access the configuration webpage of the router without having to know what the IP address of the router is, which is especially helpful if you're one of the few folks who had to change the IP address of the router because of a conflicting device or your particular network setup. So a handy shortcut. Now, for this feature to work, your device must be using the DNS server provided by the router, in this case, the 192.168.0.1. Now, I'm going to show you what would happen if you try to access this URL or this domain name from a device that's not connected to a TP-Link router. For example, if you're on mobile data, or if you're on a home, office, or a school network, or office network rather. So this is the web page that you would see if you're not connected to a TP-Link branded router, or if something is wrong with the configuration. So it says here that you're not connected to your TP-Link router. To access, you must be connected to the router network. Check it and try again. Clear your cache, or you may get the wrong DNS server according to one of the items here. I'm using Tor browser here because this computer that I'm using right now is actually connected to a TP-Link router. So you can clearly see the difference between the two scenarios here. This one is if you're not connected to a TP-Link router. This one is if you're connected. So it's mainly for your convenience. So instead of remembering the IP address of your router, you can just type tplinkwifi.net. And for that function to work, or feature to work, you must be using the DNS server provided by your router. So that's one reason. Another reason, this is again another one of my hunches. If you have a better explanation, feel free to write it down in the comments. Is that this prevents redundant requests from hitting the DNS servers that you specified earlier. So because the router is acting as a DNS server, it's going to be the one to talk to the DNS servers you provided in the settings. So in this case, instead of your computer or your tablet or your smartphone asking Cloudflare DNS directly, your router is going to be the one to ask Cloudflare DNS on behalf of your device. Now, the upshot of this is that if there are several devices, like let's say that all of you at home are going to go to youtube.com and watch a live stream of sorts, instead of 10 different devices asking the DNS server 10 different times, your router is going to ask Cloudflare DNS once, and it's going to cache the results. So whenever there's another device asking what is the IP address for youtube.com, it already queried that before, so your router is able to give that device a response immediately instead of having to ask an upstream DNS server and, wasting a lot of precious bandwidth. So that's one of my hunches. It improves, network efficiency by asking the DNS servers once instead of repeatedly querying them every time a device on the network, several devices on the network want to connect to the same website. But another crucial thing is, especially if you're if you're fond of connecting several devices together to the network, is host names. If you're using the built-in DNS server, which is the default of your router, you will be able to connect to devices on your router through their host name instead of the IP address. So what does this mean? Let's say you have a network share on one of your computers. So let's take a look at the first device on the list. So this device is named TP-Link Test Device 3. Instead of typing the IP address of the device 192.168.0.197 here, you could just type the host name of your device, let's say in File Explorer on Windows or on a Mac, or to connect to that device instead of remembering their IP address, because these things can change. Because these things are not permanent. They can change, every 24 hours or so, depending on the settings of your router. So that's some of the reasons why your router is running its own, DNS server. Partly it's to make your life easier, especially if you are networking with multiple devices and you need to communicate with one another. Also to improve efficiency by caching results, so the DNS server that you specified in settings advanced internet here won't get hit several times, and also to provide some nifty functionality like using an easy to remember domain name to go to the configuration page of your router instead of having to remember what IP address your router is using. Especially helpful if you have a custom configuration. Side note here, if you own a TP-Link extender or Wi-Fi repeater, you'll know that if you go to tplinkextender.net, okay, it's tplinkrepeater.net, not extender, tplinkrepeater.net. If you go to that address there, this is supposed to be a web page for a range extender. So another application there. Now, according to this comment, what would happen if I put the 1.1.1.1 or other IP address of the DNS server in the DHCP server settings? If you put the IP address there, it's basically going to change the value going to be received by your devices. So instead of going through your router, in the case of DNS, your device is going to query the DNS server, for example, of Cloudflare directly. So you may view this as a bit of an advantage. For example, if you want your devices to talk to the DNS server for the DNS server directly instead of going to the router, you could see this as an improvement because there's no middleman involved, depending on your use case. But unless you know what you're doing, I would not recommend this, because the DHCP server, it's not going to, it's just going to send out this information once until a device requests for a lease again. Well, That's the proper term. A DHCP lease. What does that mean? What are these new terminologies? What is a okay? Let's take a step back. Let's go back to the client screen where I showed you these host names and the IP addresses. Of course, you may have noticed or may not have noticed, but every time you connect a new device to your router, it doesn't matter if you're connecting it via a wired connection here on the back or wirelessly, through the antennas here. You never had to enter an IP address or assign an IP address to each device connecting to your network. Imagine, let's say you're running a guest network at a party and you had to assign IP addresses manually to each device of your friends and family, coworkers, and what have you. That would be pretty annoying, and ensuring that there are no duplicates is really hard. So DHCP actually makes our life a lot easier by handing out leases. And basically, when a device is connected to a network and it doesn't have an IP address yet, it's going to ask anyone on the network, hey, can someone give me an IP address I could use so I can connect to your network and connect to the internet? And that's the job of the DHCP server. It assigns IP addresses to the devices on the network. So that's a pretty nifty thing. But it turns out that the DHCP server not only gives out an IP address, it also gives, let me bring back that screenshot here, subnet mask, which defines which devices on the network can be talked to directly and which other devices need to be routed through an external network. It also gives out the default gateway and, of course, DNS server information. Now, in this case, I'm using a default configuration, which uses the IP address of the router as the gateway, DHCP server, and DNS server. You can see it right here. It says here in DHCP server, as you can see. So that's the job of DHCP. It assigns IP addresses. That's why it's called Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. That's the full name of the protocol there. So that's the job of DHCP, and that's the reason why you're getting 192.168.0.1 there. So that's what would happen if you give 1.1.1.1 or 1.0.0.1 as primary and secondary DNS. Now let's go back to what would happen. Now DHCP leases are only there for a specific period. Could be 12 hours, 24 hours. I forgot the default for TP-Link routers, but typically it's 12 to 24 hours. The reason for this lease time is if this lease doesn't expire, sooner or later, your devices are going to accumulate with a lot of IP addresses, and the router isn't able to clear out and make free other IP addresses that are no longer being used by devices that are no longer connected. And you might be surprised that you're no longer able to connect new devices to your network because your DHCP server has run out of addresses. So to prevent that issue, leases expire after a certain amount of time. Once that expires, that unused IP addresses become available for any other device to use. So that's the reason why there is a expiration period for the lease. Until that lease expires, if you change the DNS server settings here in DHCP server, what would happen is your other devices won't be able to pick up that configuration change immediately. They would still be using the existing DNS server settings until their leases expire. So I believe the only way to force a renewal is to go through advanced configuration of your router, or disconnect and reconnect, or if that still doesn't work, you might have to restart your device, or even worse, forget the network and reconnect to it again. So I recommend that if you want to change your DNS server, do it from the Internet tab and leave the DHCP server setting alone. Leave it to use the default IP address as the DNS server handed out. Essentially instructing devices, if you need to use DNS, use the router's DNS server. That way, if we use the Internet tab and in the future we change this DNS address to something else, all the devices will pick up on that change immediately. Because for future queries, the router is going to ask, instead of the old values, it's going to ask the new servers that you've placed here. Whereas if you put it in the DHCP server setting, what would happen is it would take until the next renewal or the next lease of the device in order to change its DNS settings, which could be 12 hours, 24 hours. So in short, my recommendation: leave these fields at their default. Use the internet page to change the DNS address. If you know what you're doing with DHCP server, like you're running your own DNS server, if you have some advanced cases, go ahead, feel free to put your whatever IP address you want there. But I would recommend that you leave these at the default, which is blank, or whatever default setting is there, and change the IP address of the DNS server being used on the internet page of your router. That's my recommendation. So this is going to answer your question. It's not the same thing. If you put Cloudflare DNS in DHCP server, it's going to make it a little more complicated when you change DNS servers in the future. And this is the reason why it looks like nothing has changed. Now, one last recommendation. If you want to verify that you're using the correct DNS server, I would recommend a website called DNSLeakTest.com. This is a service that will test if you're using the proper DNS server, or if some other DNS server is being used. So that might seem like that will allow you to confirm that you're actually connecting to the DNS server you provided. So one last thing, let's go through the rest of the comments while we're at it. What would happen if I change my DNS server? Can it make the internet faster or what? It's going to make your internet feel faster, especially if you choose a high performance DNS server like Cloudflare DNS, especially if the original DNS servers assigned to you by your ISP are slow or sometimes delayed. However, while it does not do anything in terms of bandwidth or internet speed, megabits per second, changing DNS would help in the responsiveness of your connection, especially if your original DNS, as I've mentioned, is a lot slower than other offerings out there. So it can make the internet feel faster because sites load a little earlier than before, because faster responses from the DNS server, but it won't do anything with your bandwidth. Let's go to the other questions. There are some commenters asking, how do I change the DNS settings on D-Link routers? I don't have a D-Link router, and I haven't used any of their routers, and I don't have a link to a simulator for a D-Link router. My advice: please review the documentation that came with your router. Look at the manual, or you can search for the manual online. You can find a PDF, and you can find instructions on how to change the DNS settings there. Or you can search for other videos on YouTube that instruct how to change DNS with D-Link routers. So that's okay. This is a video response to putting Cloudflare DNS in the DHCP server settings, and hope this explanation has been helpful. Again, keep those comments coming. I appreciate your responses. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.